Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Ottawa has ordered a national security review of what's turning out to be a pretty contentious Canada-China investment deal. Ottawa needs to decide pretty soon whether to approve the sale of Canadian gold mining firm to a foreign entity. The buyer, Shandong Gold Mining Company, is China's second largest gold producer and is state-owned. But in June, just as soon as the two firms went public with a deal, a flood of voices said Canada must block it. I'm now joined tonight with several different people that are experts on this topic that I'm going to ask to introduce themselves to you because I think there's some of the most credible voices that we need to understand. We have Jessica Chadian, Rob Hubert, and Charles Burton. And maybe, Rob, I could start with you. Tell us a little bit about your background and what you bring to the table in this discussion, if you could.
Sure, absolutely. I'm Rob Hubert from the Department of Political Science at the University of Calgary. My area of study is Arctic security, and I've been doing this actually since the end of the 1980s. And the major focus that I've had is, of course, issues of sovereignty and security as it pertains to Canada. But really where the focus of my research today is this newly evolving strategic environment that is now replacing what many saw as an area of cooperation within the Arctic. And so the actions of countries such as Russia, China, the United States, Norway are all, of course, interest. And in fact, we see many signs of a return to the old days of the Cold War. And that's really where my focuses are today.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Jessica Chadian, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you bring to this discussion, please.
Great. Thanks for having me here. So I'm presently the president and CEO of Arctic 360. It's Canada's, as a moment, only Arctic-specific think tank. And our focus is to both educate Canadians at home and carry our Canadian message abroad in the international sphere. And our specific focus is on educating Canadians about opportunities in the North, and specifically focused around financial institutions in working between Northerners, financial institutions, and other parties to figure out how we can spur and attract major investment to build critical infrastructure in the Canadian North, which obviously lends to this discussion that we're having here today. I'll just say that I've been before this, an academic in this space for close to 20 years. I've also lived in northern Norway, Iceland, and spent time in a lot of the circumpolar north. And I do know that it's not impossible, it's not inhospitable, and so impossible to have a prosperous and sustainable northern, economy. It's a choice that we've made here in Canada. And if you look around some of our, especially Nordic partners, you'll understand the possibilities and what they are. And so it's kind of trying to bring attention here at home that, there's a lot we should be doing and that we haven't been doing in terms of our own North. And that does, as Rob says, leads to a huge gap and it lends to, issues of security, but also, wellness and economic sustainability for Northerners themselves. So.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. Charles Burton, tell us about yourself, please.
Well, my area of expertise is not in the Canadian Arctic, but in the Chinese Communist Party. It's domestic and foreign policy. So I was educated in China, and the language of my family is Mandarin Chinese, so I spend a lot of time accessing mainland Chinese materials in the Chinese language relating to the Chinese Communist Party's rule of China and its global geostrategic ambitions. Presently, I'm a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and a non-resident senior fellow at the European Values Center for Security Policy, where I've been working on primarily Chinese communist influence operations in Western democracies.
Well, we've got some real experts here tonight. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more and understand what this issue is and what the different potential decisions that the Canadian government could make could and should be with the opinion of these individuals. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. We're chatting tonight. Frankly, given the expertise of our panelists, we could be chatting about a whole bunch of different topics, and maybe we'll touch on them. But we're chatting tonight about Canada, China relationships in regards to one specific deal. The buyer is Shandong Gold Mining Company, China's second largest gold producer, and it's state owned, and it's trying to buy a Canadian company, a gold mining company, TMAC, a struggling Canadian gold mining company that's based in Hope Bay, Nunavut. The federal government, specifically the federal minister of science, industry, and innovation, has to make a decision on this. There's a bunch of different things at stake, including what the price tag is, what benefits Canada is going to receive, both in royalties, gold that's extracted, land management, environmental permitting is an issue, implementation of a Inuit impact benefit agreement, mining jobs. It just goes on and on and on in what the issues are. But I think the big issue is, do we want China's second largest state-owned gold mining company to own this investment in the Canadian Arctic? Maybe I could start with you, Jessica. Tell me what you think the Canadian government should do in this situation.
Well, I think before that, the big question is, why is it for sale in the first place? And what led to the situation where TMAC needs to sell its mine, which then leads also to, we seem to know that there has only been one bidder. And so you have to wonder why there was only one bidder, and it was this Chinese, it's a Chinese state-run company. And so I think part of the decision Canada is going to have to make is what it means to say no. And I think that Charles could speak to the broader implications of that probably in terms of China-Canada relations. But what it means to say no, and then are they going to then what? Are they going to replace that with something else? Because when you're talking about the Inuit, you have an Inuit organization who part of their impact benefit agreement is also equity shares in that company. And so they have a lot to lose if this whole deal goes sour and the mine folds. And then they also should be asking themselves, well, why is this failing? And it's failing. It's a small junior mining company that doesn't have a lot of maneuverability, with any sort of implications that can go on during the process of building up this mine. And so therefore, why are they in that situation? What are we doing to support junior mines, especially Canadian ones? Should we be doing more? And we know that in the past, in Canadian history, we have put investments into the infrastructure, the supporting infrastructure for mine projects. And that's something that we don't do, and we don't do any longer. We haven't really been doing that. And so to operate in the north, it's anywhere from 30 to 60% more. The costs are that much higher. And so do we want to be, does Canada want to be in a situation where, they're able to support junior mining companies, Canadian particularly, if they're, trying to get up and running? Is there an opportunity to help them now? Is it too far along? And then therefore what does that mean, and how to go forward? It
sounds to me like your argument is that Canada should be making this infrastructure investment and exploiting the gold mining opportunity themselves, rather than relying on Chinese state-run companies to invest. And so I guess, Charles, maybe I could turn to you and ask you a little bit about what you think China's true motives and ambitions are. I understand that in 2018, China published a white paper on Arctic strategy and foresees building what they call a polar silk road, carving out trading shipping routes between Asia and Europe via the Atlantic Pacific passageways, exploiting existing ports, bringing in large equipment, icebreakers, submarines, etc. And yet this mine is only 100 kilometers away from a major NORAD station. What do you think China's intentions are?
Well, I think that you're bringing up the Polar Silk Road is significant, and China has also tried to characterize itself as a near Arctic state, although, there's no part of China that's really near the Arctic, objectively speaking. But, clearly China has identified the Arctic as an area that they want to expand their geostrategic reach. And, when you look at a company like Shandong Gold, at the top of its corporate pyramid is its Chinese Communist Party branch and its Chinese Communist Party secretary. And so all enterprises in China are not entirely based on profitability for any shareholders, but to serve the overall interests of the Chinese state in its geostrategic plans. And China has a larger scale plan that by 2050, China will be the dominant global power in what they call the community of the common destiny of mankind, which would be replacing the United States as the predominant force in the world and bringing multilateral institutions like the UN and WTO into an abeyance to be replaced by China-oriented institutions. And the Belt and Road Initiative, for which the Polar Silk Road could be a part, is designed to restructure all global infrastructure towards China. All those belts and roads terminate in the People's Republic of China. So it's part of a very audacious and ambitious scheme to legitimate the power of the Chinese Communist Party when they don't have, legitimation by, say, free and fair elections. So I would be concerned that, the purpose of the Chinese state in acquiring this mine is not entirely about, getting gold and making profit on it, but to serve other Chinese regime goals, which could be of a strategic nature. It does go out onto the Northwest Passage. I gather Rob could speak more authority on this. I gather it's not of enormous strategic significance because the waters are relatively shallow there, but you could open up the way for more Chinese investment and acquisition of potential port facilities and, bringing in submarines to map the Arctic waters, and in general, China trying to establish a presence in a region of the planet that China perceives as being of greater and greater geostrategic importance, with rivalry with Russia and everywhere else. So I'm inclined to be of the same opinion that I really wish that Canada would become more engaged with the importance of that region, and we should be putting more resources into it, and we shouldn't be, giving foreign states ownership of key Canadian mining and energy
assets,
resources. And I would also, just to conclude, point out that this is not reciprocal. Under the Chinese Constitution, foreign enterprises cannot acquire Chinese natural resources under any circumstances. So I have a lot of concern about it, and I am concerned that our government has spent 45 days reviewing this deal and is now asking for an extension of another 45 days. I'm not clear on what's taking so much time in terms of doing a cost-benefit analysis as to whether this deal serves the Canadian interest or whether it, in fact, would be damaging to our overall interest. Within the context that I do believe, myself, that we should be doing much more development in the Arctic and providing opportunities for Indigenous peoples to have economic development. But I don't think it should be done by the Chinese state.
Well, so Rob, maybe I could turn to you and ask you about the political ramification of this. I understand that the Chinese country, maybe not government, has already invested in another gold mine and a copper mine, a zinc mine, I apologize, and a copper mine in Canada's north. There seems to be a race internationally to own resources, and China seems to be leading that race. We've got some major issues between Canada and China today. There's major issues between China and the United States, both with the Trump administration and probably with the upcoming Biden administration. Are we between a rock and a hard place?
It's a rock and a hard place that we've placed ourselves there. The thing that, to bring together a lot of the stuff that both Charles and Jessica have talked about, part of the reason why we're facing a dilemma can be directly attributed to a series of government policies that have basically created the worst of all worlds. Now, consider this. Gold prices are at the highest that we've ever seen them, period, full stop. We have had no other bids on this gold company. This company is trying to sell because they say they can't make a profit. They haven't been able to attract any Canadian or other North American or Western European buyer, none. And so that tells you something. And all of a sudden the Chinese come forward and buy and they say, okay. The other political factor that we have to put in is, once again, when we look at the policies that have been brought in by the Liberals, when it talks about in the context of resource development in the Arctic, they have placed the very strong emphasis on conservation, not on economic development. We see this on the ban of any offshore oil and gas development, sort of it's a throwback to colonial days when Ottawa basically told the territories what to do. In the case of the offshore development, the three premiers and the various indigenous groups weren't even consulted when Trudeau got together with Obama and said, okay, we're putting a moratorium on oil and gas. We've expanded the conservation areas within the Arctic region under parks, so that has reduced mining. And we've made it a very uncertain. If you talk to any of the mining corporations, they'll tell you that the uncertainty that the Liberal government has created for domestic production is problematic. And so it's not surprising that these companies aren't jumping up. And so we've created a situation now where Canadian companies and Americans and Western Europeans just simply don't like the uncertainty that comes in. And so we see China, just in the way that Charles has outlined, in terms of the utilization of their economic instruments as a means of policy, not of economic development, but as policy. And so China, of course, comes in, and we've seen this in Alaska with the Red Dog mine off on the west coast of Alaska. We've seen them try to do this in Greenland and Iceland, and they will go for businesses, the resource businesses that are economically problematic, shall we say. And so the question that we have to ask is, why is China turning around then and saying, okay, we'll come into the Hope mine, even though nobody else is, because the Liberals have basically placed the emphasis on conservation rather than on economic development. And why are we even therefore thinking about allowing the Chinese to come in? To show the very political nature of this, the government also was very reluctant until several voices, Charles included, started raising facts of a security examination. In other words, when the Chinese came forward with their offer to purchase it, the Canadian government was absolutely silent on whether or not it was going to do a security clearance. And it was only when there were a series of unified voices. So there was Charles, there was David Maroney, the former ambassador to China, Richard Fadden, the former security advisor to the Harper government, saying, you got to do the security clearance. They did it reluctantly, and there are very clear indications, of course, that the Liberals have a strong point or acceptance of the Chinese form. Remember, Trudeau said, when asked about what governments he admired, he picked China as, I think it was his second choice or so. And I think we have to take these things very, very serious. Now, consider the point you just raised, that there's an extension on the security review that the Liberal government did not want to do. Now, you have to ask the question, why right now are they extending that security review? And would it have anything to do with the possibility that the Americans are now talking about not extraditing putting in the request for the executive that then caused the Chinese to bring economic sanctions against Canada and to basically kidnap two of our own nationals? So in other words, the very political nature of here is clear as opposed to any economic conditions. And now if I can just sort of pick up on a major theme that Charles brought in about the Polar Silk Road. one of the things that has to be understood is that the Chinese have a very long view. And we're seeing this in terms of how they are approaching these issues that from an economic perspective, Western companies are somewhat questioning in terms of whether or not they should go in. What is starting to emerge that, once again, building on Charles's point, that China wants to be the major hegemon, the major power in the international system, is that they take their lessons in terms of how did the United States and how did Great Britain do it. And basically what they did in both instances is they created economic entities that then went ahead of state policy. They then built up their navy. And once again, look at the history of Canada. Hudson Bay Company, Northwest Company mean anything to you? And so that we see the way that the British were able to come into Canada and take control over it against any of their rivals, build the navy. And once again, how did you do it? You get economically questionable positioning where you can, in fact, put a foothold. So, of course, the Chinese are going to come
Rob,
in.
if no one else, it's internationally marketed. If no one else has bid, and these are the only people that have bid to buy this struggling mine, and they're going to not only buy the mine, but they're going to exploit the gold, and they're going to develop the local economy and provide jobs and infrastructure, etc. Shouldn't we thank them rather than question?
I'll see here. That's why I'm saying we are being foisted on our own Picard because we have created the circumstances where there aren't anyone coming in. And we say, of course, watch what they do if they are allowed to come in. Watch what they do for infrastructure and see the manner in which they will entrench themselves. And you say, of course, well, of course we should be letting them in. After all, look at the jobs and economies that they bring in. But the reason why they are going to appear like such saviors from an economic perspective is we have created the circumstances to allow them to appear that manner.
Jessica, what do you think?
Yeah. Well, I'll just say if they look like saviors, we just look to Africa and see how that went with Chinese investment there. But I want to maybe pick up a little bit on, so it was interesting, Charles, that you looked at, you used the time period of 2050 for when China could be a world power. And 2050 is right around the same time that it's looking very likely, if not before, that the Arctic Ocean is going to be fully ice-free during at least the summertime. And I think one of the main, and it also speaks to Rob's, speaking to Rob's comment about this particular government and the focus on conservation. And, the Belt and Road Initiative, like has been pointed out, this is it was like a 50-year plan. This is a long-term strategy. It was a vision and a strategy for where they wanted to be in 50 years from now. And what we are lacking here in Canada is exactly that. We maybe can't think in 50-year terms, but we could even be thinking in 20-year terms. And we need a vision for our North, and it's one that's not just a continuation of this idea about a place that's just inhospitable, it's meant for social, it's just the federal government has to just, support social welfare in the North. It's not a place that should be owned by the polar bears. We need a real vision.
So you're arguing against conservation and to economic development?
No, it's about building in a real vision and a strategy for, a strategy, I would say, well, we need so I would say in two specific areas. This is not conservation versus non-conservation. That's not the thing. We can have sustainable development. That's something we could do anywhere in the world, so why can't we do it in the Arctic? And so that's a false dichotomy that a lot of people like to set up, that it's either we put the Arctic in a snow globe or it's just unfettered, horrific industrial pollution everywhere. That's not how we develop any other part of the world these days, so we shouldn't think that that's the choice for the Arctic. I would say that we need a long-term infrastructure investment strategy, which is part of a bigger vision that we need for the North. And I would say part of this also is we need to really understand and have some sort of let's say feasibility study, a governance agenda, a vision for the whole Northwest Passage, whether that's an Arctic Seaway idea, collaborating with the Americans or also with the Greenlanders, or if this is something just for Canadians. But we've got a situation where open waters 2050, you've got, all roads wanting to point to Beijing, by 2050, which they're doing a pretty good job so far. And it's only Canadians internally who think we own the Northwest Passage. And so we need to contend with that and figure out Well,
don't we have the same problem with the Americans? Aren't the Americans just as interested in controlling and owning the Northwest Passage?
So, well, I will just say, if you look at what the Russians have done, they put together several feasibility studies. They looked at, how much gas resources they could potentially have, what kind of revenue that could bring, what kind of revenues they can generate from icebreaker services, how much infrastructure is going to cost to be able to support that, which is both civil and military. And then they set out and they did it. And they're now building a whole seaway, the Northern Sea Route.
Sounds like we need to have this plan for the North. There's just no question.
Well, no one is sitting around wondering whether or not, the Northern Sea Route is Russian or not. And so
we're chatting tonight with
build it and it will be there. And if you're governing it and you're governing it sustainably and well done, I don't think everyone's going to come rushing to argue whether or not that you own it, because
we're chatting tonight with Jessica Shadden, Rob Hubert, Charles Burton. Fascinating conversation about what's going to happen in the Canadian North in regards to Chinese ownership of some of our resources. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more with these experts in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're chatting tonight with three experts on what's going on both with the Arctic and also with Canadian-Chinese relations. There is a proposal for a Canadian mining company, a junior mining company, to be purchased by a Chinese state-run company. And some people think it's great. It's the only company that bid international marketing of this company's assets called TMAC, and only one company bid, and it was a Chinese state-owned company, and others are disagreeing with it. Charles, let me give you 2 points if I could, and ask you a question. I had the privileges of doing a doctorate in business in Fudan University in Shanghai. And I ended up taking a course from a former deputy government of the Bank of China. And he spoke about the Beijing consensus versus the Washington consensus in great passion, and talked about how it was a far better way to develop, and looked at how many countries worldwide in Latin America and Asia and elsewhere had followed the Washington consensus and didn't work out. And the Beijing consensus worked out fantastically. And so I guess I got to ask you the question, what's so wrong with what they're doing? And then, Jessica spoke about Africa. I was in Lagos, Nigeria, at a conference making a keynote presentation about a year and a half ago. Major infrastructure, LRTs, highways, and something like an 800-acre real estate development into the ocean to protect Lagos, but build real estate, 100% funded by the Chinese. So they are actually willing to do and willing to invest the kind of money that the rest of the world just doesn't appear to be willing to invest in infrastructure development in places that clearly need it. So if the Beijing consensus is actually working, and if they're making this investment, how different is it from the Marshall Plan? How different is it from the British building railways in India or Africa? Why is it so bad? Why is it so wrong? Tell me about it.
Well, I would say, for one thing, just to start off, I also attended Fudan University. It's where I did my undergraduate, but that was in the Mao era, and we certainly didn't talk about business in those days. We were making revolution for the workers, peasants, and soldiers, and a lot of my time at the university, I was laboring in the countryside. But anyway, People's Commune, different time, different context, but still the same Communist Party with the same sorts of ambitions, which are to restore China's greatness. You know, Xi Jinping talks about the Chinese dream of the great revitalization of China, and it's really about, bringing China back to what they regard as its natural place as the dominant power on the planet. So when you see these infrastructural projects, which private capital sees as infeasible, but which the Chinese state is prepared to put huge amounts of money into, I think one has to look at it as not being entirely about, the ostensible purpose of helping out with infrastructure or developing mines or port facilities, but because the Chinese state has other plans which serve the interests of the Chinese state probably more than the interests of the recipients of the largesse. China talks about it as win-win, and as you say, the Beijing consensus, and based on cultural norms which are more agreeable to third world dictatorships than liberal democratic norms. But if you look at the record of China in investments throughout the world, they have not been a reliable, trusting partner who believes in corporate responsibility. You have a history of bribery, corruption, violation of the norms of labor and safety, and a lot of issues with environment. And so the question really is, if you look at a company like Shandong Gold, will they behave in their acquisition of a Canadian mine differently than their practices in their mining operations in third world countries? And I think it's unrealistic to expect that. And we've seen over and over again the Chinese state making commitments to Canada, particularly say with the CNOOC-Nexen deal, where they'd maintain the existing management structure and other commitments to corporate responsibility, and then you find that they shortly thereafter replace the Canadian managers with Chinese communist officials sent out from China, and they and we start to get pipeline leaks, such as we're not seeing as much with other companies. So, there is a history there, and it's not an encouraging history. There's also the tendency of China to take away the local employment opportunities on some spurious basis, such as we're putting in a new technology. The engineers who will be overseeing it only speak Mandarin Chinese, therefore will only be employing local people in the Arctic who are fluent in Mandarin Chinese. And then when they can't get them, they apply for an immigration exemption and bring in labor from China who work under conditions which are not consistent with Canadian norms. So, I mean, there's a huge number of reasons why one has to look carefully at Chinese investment. I mean, certainly one can see that there could be valid reasons for the Chinese state to want to source minerals and oil from Canada because, compared to other countries that they operate in, we are stable politically, and we respect contractual obligations and are not likely to engage in arbitrary action to try and squeeze more money out of the Chinese partner. So, Canada's clearly a good place to do business. But in general, I just don't think that these investments where the Chinese state takes full ownership of a Canadian resource are a good idea. And as Rob points out, they tend to lead to the Chinese establishing themselves firmly in an area and then wanting to push the envelope to gain more control. So, there's the possibility that you have a port, it's been built with Chinese money for trade purposes, but then the Chinese want to start bringing in military facilities in there to expand their potential geostrategic reach, not to speak of issues that have existed in the third world in the Belt and Road initiative of what they call debt trap diplomacy, where in the case of two third world countries, they've had to give concessions to China, 99-year leases on entire ports because the Chinese loans were unable to be repaid because of, I think, infeasibility of the projects and possibly official corruption in the recipient states. So, there are many issues here that suggest that this is probably not the right direction for Canada to go. And I think we ought to be looking more at what Jessica and Rob are saying about getting things right in the Arctic. And if I could just, one thing I'd like to ask Rob about is if there are any implications of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People that, Canada is currently trying to codify into law in terms of empowering the people living in those areas to tell our government that they want development on a basis that will be economically competitive and allow for them to enjoy the benefits of modern development in the pristine Arctic areas.
Rob?
I mean, the challenge with that is, of course, is that we in the South, we tend to have this stereotype, and I think it's quite harmful, of course, when we were talking about what Indigenous Northerners want. And the reality is you go right across the spectrum. You can have a Mary Simon who is very concerned about conservation and the protection of the environment. And you can have a Nellie Cormier who's very concerned about what economic development potential there is. And so, I mean, once again, we've sort of, and to a large degree, this is part of the political rhetoric that's been created by both the Liberals and the Conservatives, that there's one voice when we're talking about the functioning of the Indigenous populations. And the problem is that's not true. There are some that want to have economic full stop development. There's others that do want to retain their traditional way of life. And so part of the problem, it goes to a point that Jessica was raising about this lack of any real meaningful policy framework. We do have a Arctic foreign policy. We do have an Arctic policy that the Liberals brought out. They brought it out on the day before they dropped the writ for the new election. So once again, we can see how important this was for the Liberals. They kept saying how important. The major feature of it is that they say they're going to do things differently. It's going to be co-management with the Indigenous peoples and with the three territories. But the reality is, when it comes to the decisions on any of the big decisions about economic development, the Ottawa has retained those decisions to itself. It gives some paper dressing to smaller issues of cooperation, but we just simply don't have it. And so the issue of what the actual voice of the Northerners, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, want is something that we haven't gotten out of our old colonial habits, that the South likes to speak for the North. Oh, the North wants to keep it clean. The North wants economic development. Well, the problem is it suits both parties pretty well to be able to speak for them. And this is the problem that you raise here in terms of understanding what they actually want in this particular situation.
Rob, I had several people on when we were talking about pipelines, and that was the big issue. When was it? Like 11 months ago, before COVID, I think January of this year. And a lot of people spoke about the Indian Act as like colonialism. Do we have the same problem with our Indigenous population and areas as we do with what you've described as the North?
Well, as soon as we resolve the treaty negotiations and the land ownership issue with all of the Northern Indigenous peoples, we saw, in fact, that once they actually got control of their own lands, in fact, a lot of them started moving very closely to not only allowing pipelines to be built, but they actually turned around and started creating things such as the Northern Indigenous Pipeline Consortium. Once again, this was led by people like Nellie Cormier, the former premier of Northwest Territories, who turned around and said, okay, now that we've got the land claim settlements in, we want to prosper the same way that, say, white Albertans prosper with their pipelines. And they cut a deal with with major pipeline construction companies saying, look, we'll clear the way for you in terms of relationships with the Indigenous peoples. We will clear it because we, of course, have ownership now through the treaties that have been negotiated. And you pay up front our part of the capital for building the pipeline. And as the pipeline produces profit, we will then pay off and we will be a co-investor with you. And the whole vision, you know, if you talk to any of the individuals that were involved in that negotiation, was, hey, we've got ownership. Colonialism has been put to the side. Now, some of us want to be capitalists just like the rest of white Canada. Give us the opportunity to do so. The thing that scuttled the deal for the gas pipeline was all of a sudden the prices of gas just collapsed. So they had the misfortune of just being at the wrong time from an economic perspective. But had gas prices remained where they were, we would probably be seeing the development of an Indigenous pipeline consortium that would be very, once again, on a capitalist model. And we say, oh, Indigenous organizations and capitalism. give them actual ownership of their land, and there will be those of them that say yes to go ahead. So to get to your point, once again, had economics been right, we would have seen not really a distinction between, I can't remember if it was Exxon or who the other two companies were that they were working with, but we would have had them rubbing shoulders as equal partners on the construction of the Mackenzie Valley pipeline.
Jessica, if you're Prime Minister, what would you do?
In this decision?
Yes.
I would start looking north much more. I think I don't see myself being Prime Minister, but I just think us as Canadians, we need to start taking the north much more seriously. We need to see it as an opportunity. And we need to see it as an opportunity, but also recognize, I think this goes exactly, to Rob's, what Rob was just saying, and just going back to what Charles was saying, you were asking about UNDRIP, but the heart of UNDRIP is self-determination, and the heart of self-determination is the ability to decide for yourself if and how you want to develop your land and your resources, and if there's waters accompanying that. And so the land claims agreements were to speak exactly to that, to give the, ability then for Indigenous, groups, and for in this case, for Northerners, but in other cases for other First Nations groups around Canada, to be able then to make that decision for themselves, and also then, of course, if they decide to develop, to benefit from those resources. And I think then going back to this earlier thing, Rob, that you were talking about with the moratorium that Trudeau and Obama just dropped onto everyone was entirely counter to anything UNDRIP, anything that has to, anything in line with the land claims agreements in the North, because it was basically Ottawa speaking and overriding the rights that the Northerners have. And so I think that, if we're gonna take the North seriously, and we need to take the North seriously, which is what we should be doing, this is something that we do together with Northerners, and I think we need to recognize that it's not either or. It's not for conservation or against conservation, but how do we work together to build the North? And this is not co-development or whatever these kind of things are. This is like taking the North seriously.
Taking the North seriously, and putting in infrastructure spending, investment, and also finalizing the land claims so that they have private ownership and can make the decisions on that.
And that's the thing. At the end of the day, they should be the owners, right? They should be the owners of these assets in the North, and not the Chinese. Because,
but it's Rob,
just on your point on UNDRIP, there's another important issue here. This is, of course, a security issue, but I try to keep my ear close to this. And I mean, Jessica and Charles can correct me if I'm wrong. I have heard absolutely no outreach from the federal government to, in fact, have a discussion in any type of, if they are, they're secret, they're not being shared, in terms of what the government thinks, say, ICC Canada or ITK or any of the various Indigenous organizations. What do they think about the Chinese investment? What does Nathan think about it? What does Dwayne Smith think about it? I've heard absolutely nothing. Now, there may be conversations that I'm simply not privy to, but if this co-management principle that is the foundation of the Arctic policy today is actually in place, how come we're not hearing more about this? And to get to your point in terms of, you asked Jessica what she would do as Prime Minister. One of the things, of course, is you do not starve Canadian opportunities for, if you've made the decision that you are going to focus on environmental protection, you're going to have the decisions that you made with Obama where you're not going to have any offshore, environment is most important, fine. But then, for heaven's sakes, you don't turn around and say, well, China's come along, we'll make an exception and let the Chinese come and invest. Think of the logic of that. We're cutting, we're making long-term policies. And once again, they're open about it. You can vote them in, vote them out. I don't blame them for taking that position. But what I have problems with is how do you take that position that you're going to have these, the moratorium on oil and gas. You're going to make the regulatory process very difficult. You're doing all these things to basically starve the industry. And okay, fine, that's what people voted for. But you don't turn around when all of a sudden the Chinese come in with a wad of money and just say, oh, by the way, we're interested here. That's the worst of all worlds. You're not doing an economic proper policy, and you're letting the Chinese, like Charles have said, They are an authoritative state. That makes a difference in terms of whether or not it's the Beijing consensus or the Washington consensus.
We're going to take a break and come back with some concluding comments in just a minute with Charles Burton, Rob Herbert, and Jessica Shadden. Stay with us.
Okay.
What a fascinating conversation we're having tonight on the Brian Crombie Radio Hour Saga 960 about China, a potential Chinese state company investment in buying a Northwest Territories gold mine. And we're joined by Charles Burton, Rob Herbert, and Jessica Shadian. Maybe I could just ask each one of you to give me a concluding statement on what you think Canada in this situation should do. Charles, can I start with you?
Well, I think particularly listening to what Jessica and Rob have been saying, it seems to me that, if Canada is not prepared to get serious about the North and recognize it's, we're now at a crux point with the melting of the polar ice cap, that China will come in and fill that vacuum. And we already know that there are, senior Chinese who are seeking to curry favor with some of our indigenous leaders up there through various means, some of which may not be all that on the level. And I don't think that they would be amenable to that kind of thing if Canada was doing the right thing and getting in there and facilitating the development, which is so critical to our national future. So I would say, no Chinese investment, but much more Canadian engagement.
Jessica?
I think I would say it's, well, first of all, we should recognize that the North, our Canadian North, is 40% of Canada's territory.
Wow.
And we need to start recognizing that North as part of the whole of Canada. And so to take it as seriously as we do the rest of Canada and make it officially and structurally part of the rest of Canada. And, I would say this is perhaps a golden opportunity for Canada to turn a page, perhaps. Turn the page and say, well, I'm going to say no to this investment here, this takeover, but what we're going to do instead is this, and we're going to invest in these 6 different ways that's going to maybe help TMAC then survive or have some sort of, a different structured ownership, and which is just the first step then at the beginning of a whole new approach to the North, which is one that's going to take it seriously and figure out how we do the best kind of investments and the type that we need to do to build the critical infrastructure we need to keep Canada and Northerners safe, to keep to grow the entire northern or Canadian economy, but also then develop the whole northern economy itself, so people themselves can be self-sufficient, self-reliant, self-sustaining, and figure out how they want to grow their own economy in the North. So
Rob,
I think it's a good opportunity.
In the 1960s, Walter Gordon, opposed American investment in Canada. In the 1980s, Pierre Trudeau took over the petrochemical business in Alberta because of foreign investment. Is that what you're recommending?
No, I'm not. I'm recommending 2 things. First of all, we have to have an Arctic policy that goes beyond just simply a principle of co-management as its hallmark. Fine. I mean, you can, there's critics and there's supporters of that, and that's fine. But we now need a policy that deals with substance, that gets to the heart of what Jessica was saying, that of course addresses the difficult problem that you need sustainability and you need environmental protection. In other words, she's absolutely right. You can't, it's not an either or, and that's a difficult thing to do, but you need to take the bull by the horns. You do need foreign investment, full stop. I mean, ever since the MacDonald Commission basically said that liberalization of trade was Canada's future and the ultimate proof through the free trade agreement, when in fact we've seen prosperity of a level that's never really existed before, yeah, foreign investment is going to be an element of it. But it has to be smart foreign investment. The idea of engaging with a partner that won't let you buy into their territory, but you're letting them buy, sorry, there's got to be reciprocity. And that leads to the second major thing that the government has to do. And that is it has to get serious about understanding that Canada actually is living in an increasingly dangerous international environment. We have enemies. And the fact of the matter is that this government is very reluctant, except the only country, will criticize Israel, and that's about it. It won't ever say anything bad about any other country. But the reality is that we have to recognize and to a large degree grow up that in fact the situation has changed and there are countries that are threats to us. And so both of these have to be brought together in terms of a proper long-term policy for how we handle international investment and how we handle these new state realities.
Rob Hubert, Jessica Shaden, and Charles Burton, thank you so much for really a fascinating conversation. And bottom line, Canada needs to make a decision here and set a strategy and not just sit by. Thank you so much for illuminating us on this topic tonight. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.